Good morning, everyone. This is Penny from Wisconsin Land and Water, and we're going to get started with a total maximum daily loads webinar for today. So what I've done is, if you hadn't muted yourself, I went through and muted you just so we don't have any interference when they start doing their presentation. And just want to go through a few logistics. Today, our presenters are Kevin Kirsch, Matt Diebel, and Aaron Ruesch, and they're all from DNR. So we thank them for joining us today. They're going to take turns on presenting, and we're going to take questions at the end. So what you can do is there's a chat box, and if you see that on your screen, you can type in a message to everyone, because there's, like I said, there's a few of us monitoring this, and then we can screen the questions and see if we want to address those at any other time. So if you have a question, please just send it in the chat and send it to everyone, and then we will take those at the end of the presentation. And also, you can minimize that GoToMeeting box if you don't want to, if you just want to see the presentation going on. There's a double arrow up in the upper right hand corner. So you just push that and that'll minimize the screen. And then you can also see the chat box. You can come back on, you can unminimize it, and you can send us in your questions. We are recording it, and we've saved the other two webinars on the Wisconsin Land and Water Media website. And so this one will go on there as well. And those are there for viewing at any time. We just keep them on there. And these webinars today are presented by the Standards Oversight Council and the State Interagency Training Committee, which is SITCOM. And I think we're ready to get started. I'm going to send out in the chat line and a link for a survey later. And at the end, if you could fill that out, that would be greatly appreciated. Otherwise, I think I am ready to turn it over. And I think, Kevin, are you starting? Are you ready to take over?
Yep, thanks, Penny. So today's topic is total maximum daily loads and how they can be used as non-point source planning tools. My name is Kevin Kirsch, and I'm, as Penny mentioned, all three of us are with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Excuse me? All three of us are with the water evaluation section. I'm a water resource engineer.
This is Matt Diebel. I'm a water resources modeler. And Aaron?
This is Aaron Ruesch. I'm also a water resources modeler.
It's not moving. There we go.
So the presentation outline, there's four main things that we're going to cover today. Basically how TMDLs fit in the range of water quality planning tools and kind of how they compare to 9 key element plans, how we've selected TMDL projects, and what kind of information local stakeholders can contribute to TMDL development, looking at both what's going on in the water and then also helping characterize the land cover. And we'll also cover some of the latest tools that can be used to help with TMDL implementation. So to start with, what are TMDLs? TMDLs are required by EPA for waters that don't meet water quality standards and are impaired. And basically, a TMDL or a comparable water quality restoration plan needs to be developed. I'll get into a little bit more about the comparable water quality restoration plans in a minute, but TMDLs determine the amount of water pollutant that a water body can receive and still meet the water quality standards. TMDLs do not create new regulatory requirements and really rely on existing rules for implementation. And the TMDLs were developed as this compliance option for impaired waters, and it's really a point source model. And you can see that in the equation that's used, that a TMDL equals the load allocation plus a waste load allocation and margin of safety. The load allocation are the non-point sources, the agricultural land, including the CAFO land for spreading, non-permitted urban, and background. And the waste load allocation is all the permitted sources. And a TMDL has to have an expression of that load on a daily basis. And that's where it really fits more with a wastewater, a continuous discharge, so to speak, versus a non-point source, which is episodic and really rainfall driven. Historically, TMDLs required allocations to be expressed for all the point sources and lumped all the non-point sources together, which, and we'll kind of get into how that's led to the development of some implementation tools, because the non-point allocation was often expressed as, let's say 1,000 pounds for this watershed, and didn't really help in the implementation or targeting.
Go ahead, one.
I think it went one more. So when we look at the TMDL, we mentioned that TMDLs don't create any new regulatory requirements that rely on existing rules for implementation. And the point sources are implemented through state statute and NR 217. On the non-point side, it's NR 151 that is involved in the implementation of the non-point. And that's through NR 151, 04, and 05. So we have our existing performance standards, and the reductions in a TMDL can be promulgated through NR 151 to become site-specific performance standards. So TMDLs are one of planning tools that can be used. Lake management grants, county water plans, adaptive management, water quality trading, multi-discharge variants all become different levels of compliance and planning tools that can be used. A lot of them target, such as water quality trading, adaptive management, can target a watershed, but often use just as a compliance strategy for a couple dischargers. The TMDL kind of brings all this together in that it sets the reduction goals needed to meet water quality at a larger level, and then other water quality management plans can be used to help target in and do more refinement to that implementation. So, for example, one of the main implementation tools is 9-key element plan, and I'm kind of going to go through how they differ and similar to a TMDL. So 9-key element plans tend to be, well, they are watershed based and tend to be 12-digit HUCs. TMDLs often are developed on a 12-digit HUC basis, but are packaged together as a larger overall product. So, the example, the TMDL for the Rock River, for example, actually had 101 TMDLs in it. The Wisconsin River Basin is going to have a lot of TMDLs in it, but it's often just bundled together and referred to as the Wisconsin River Basin TMDL. In the case of the Wisconsin River Basin TMDL, a lot of those watersheds that are broken up are also at 12-digit HUC. So a 9-key element plan and a TMDL can often have kind of that same scale. One of the differences, though, is that the 9-key element plan is really targeting non-point sources only, whereas a TMDL has the ability, through the waste load allocations, to also target point sources. Both products can be used to address and protect non-impaired waters, and 9-key element plans to some extent mimic TMDLs in that they reduce the pollutant loads to meet the water quality standards. But one of the differences is that a 9-key element plan does not necessarily have to meet water quality standards. Alternative targets can be chosen. And that kind of gets into the next couple key elements of a 9-key element plan, is identify the causes and sources that need to be controlled and achieved. And that is similar to a TMDL in that you go through an allocation process. Some of the stuff that Aaron's going to be covering on how you go through and describe the land use and look at the different loading sources are the same under a TMDL or a 9-key element plan. The difference starts coming in is that often in a TMDL we stop with the allocations, whereas in a 9-key element plan you start going further and looking at implementation. So in a 9-key element plan you start looking at the different implementation measures that could be used to help achieve those reductions, and then estimate those load reductions from management practices. So not only do you have these load reductions, now you start looking at how how can these feasibly be attained, and what kind of tools, BMPs, could be used to attain those reductions. And then also elements under the 9-km plan that don't come into TMDL is you start looking at the cost of this, what sort of cost is going to be incurred to meet these reductions, and what sort of financial and technical assistance is available to help meet those reductions. There's also a I&E educational information component to help develop that plan and help with the distribution of the plan. And then there's a schedule. TMDLs themselves set the water quality goals, but do not have a strict schedule for the implementation of those reductions. Whereas a 9-km plan looks at setting different milestones. And those milestones can be set at 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but you basically set targets for those milestones to help the implementation planning moving forward. And again, I kind of mentioned those milestones can be interim, but they do have to be some sort of measurable goal. And then there has to be some sort of plan in place to determine if those load reductions aren't occurring and they aren't being occurred over a time period, what can be done? How can the plan be revised? And then on the back end, there's a monitoring component to help evaluate the overall effectiveness of the plan and integrate the schedule and milestones together. So when you look at the TMDLs and 9-km plans, the 9-km plans really do end up becoming much more implementation specific. Often we see TMDLs developed and the 9-km plans broken out. So for example, in the Rock River Basin, we have the overall TMDL package, 101 individual TMDLs, and then we have various 9-km plans being developed to really get those last components that TMDL doesn't cover. The other thing a 9-km plan does is it brings in the opportunity for funding through either EPA grant funding. 319 has been tied to water quality outcomes, which link well with 319 plans. So basically, 319s bring 9-km plans bring money available. A couple of differences, again, between a TMDL and a 9-km plan is the TMDLs have to meet water quality criteria, whereas a 9-km plan, you can set up reduction goals that do not necessarily meet the water quality criteria. You can go more stringent than the water quality criteria or back off from the water quality criteria and set basically benchmarks as you move through your implementation. Again, I mentioned 9-km plans are voluntary, as are TMDLs when it comes to the non-point source implementation, although both can aid in bringing additional implementation funding. So that was kind of the first topic, was to kind of compare and contrast the TMDLs and 9-km plans. The next portion that we were asked to cover is how TMDL project areas are selected. So if you look at a map of Wisconsin, we have in like a light orange early TMDLs that were developed. Those were basically TMDLs that were priority watershed projects that were converted over to TMDLs into the TMDL format. In the light red, we have TMDLs that are currently in various phases of implementation. And then the light green, TMDLs that are currently in development, the Wisconsin River Basin, the Upper Fox, and the Milwaukee River Basin. So of those TMDLs that are in development, we actually have a couple others. The Wisconsin River Basin and Upper Fox have a lot of work going on right now in both those TMDLs. The Milwaukee River Basin actually has been sent to EPA for approval. And the Coudray is an interesting project. Earlier when I mentioned that TMDLs have to be set to water quality criteria, the Coudray is looking at the evaluation of some alternative water quality criteria. And so without that water quality criteria being promulgated, a TMDL can't really be supported. So they're looking at a 9 key element plan because they're looking at alternative targets to meet the water quality goals for Lake Coudray. Lake Malu is in the current situation, or a similar situation, and that alternative criteria are likely needed. And so we could end up going a 9 key element route on that, but it hasn't been determined yet. Lake Pepin is a TMDL that's being led by Minnesota right now and addresses both phosphorus and TSS. And there's a revision to probably the oldest TMDL that we have. It's the Wisconsin River Basin for Biological Oxygen Demand. It was completed in the early 70s, and it's being updated now to reflect changes that have occurred in that basin. So when we look at the development of the TMDLs, the first and foremost important issue comes out to be funding. And if you look at those projects that I just gone through, a lot of those projects either were done in partnership with Minnesota or partnership with EPA, with funding from EPA. So the Milwaukee, the Upper Fox, a portion of the Wisconsin, the Lower Fox, and the Rock River were all done with the aid of EPA funding. Some other factors that we look at are stakeholder engagement, the severity of the impairments and public health concerns, and then the likelihood of restoration, and if there's ongoing water quality studies or restoration work. In addition, TMDLs can be developed by what's called a third party. And so in the case, for example, the Milwaukee River Basin TMDL, Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District initiated that TMDL study, albeit with EPA funding and grant money to support that development, but it was still initiated and led by Milwaukee Met. Lake Coudray was also started out as a third-party TMDL, but due to the fact that they wanted to go with or evaluate other alternative water quality targets, that project started to meld more into a 9 key element plan. So when we look at prioritizing future projects, we kind of take that criteria, and this map represents some of that criteria, with additionally looking at areas where we have high loadings, areas that were prioritized in our statewide nutrient reduction strategy, and looking at overall restoration potential. And so areas that came out high when you started looking at these different variables are in the bright and dark red color. The light gray is areas where we already have TMDLs approved, and then the salmon color is the Upper Fox in Wisconsin, where the TMDLs are developed. So what we have in blue are areas that were prioritized, and the last part that called those areas out in blue was funding, potential funding sources. So we were looking at projects that would be eligible for Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, Mississippi Basin funding, or other sources. The Manitowoc-Sheboygan area, when we look at emerging projects, that has come to the forefront. So initially, Manitowoc was looking to develop a TMDL to address phosphorus and TSS, the county. And there was a partnership that formed, and it was really led by the County Conservation Program. And this kind of expanded, and they were able to get grant funding. And then this kind of expanded into TMDL covering the Anape and the Sheboygan. The Wisconsin legislature, led by Representative Kitchens, kind of expanded the study to integrate with what was already being done in Manitowoc. And there was it wasn't just a possible funding request. The funding request went forward and was approved by the legislature. So this is a current project, and Matt may be touching on this. He was just yesterday deploying monitoring data to help with this project. Two other projects that are kind of emerging is a Milwaukee Basin Chloride TMDL. Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District and Sewer PAC are interested again in developing a third-party TMDL to address chlorides. And then the Root River is an area that keeps coming up, mainly because of some of the Waukesha water issues, but it was also an area that came to rise when we looked at our different priority or metrics for prioritizing a TMDL. Was an area that came up as a high priority. So next, Matt will be covering the water quality monitoring.
Okay, hi everybody, this is Matt Diebel. I'll pause for a second. Penny, are there any questions that have come up that should be addressed before the end?
I unmute myself. No, there have not been any other questions at all. So
Okay.
keep on going.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Sure.
So this is the section where we kind of get into how stakeholders can get involved in TMDL development or contribute information to help with the TMDL development process. And really, it's primarily, I'm going to cover mostly on the topic of monitoring. So really, we do water quality monitoring for a number of reasons, and I've kind of listed them here. The ones that I've highlighted in red are ones where external stakeholders outside of DNR can potentially contribute if they're interested. The first is assessing condition. So this is the way that we determine which waters are impaired. You know, a lot of what we've been talking about, we will talk about throughout this webinar, is focused on total phosphorus as the pollutant. Although TMDLs can be developed for other pollutants as well. Assessing conditions is how we determine which waters need TMDLs. That's the first step. So waters that make it on the impaired waters list or exceeding phosphorus criteria, for example, need a TMDL. That's based on pretty straightforward monthly concentration monitoring, and I'll touch in a few minutes on how stakeholders can get involved in that. When we develop TMDLs, the second two, estimating loads and calibrating watershed models, are some of the key tasks that we take on. So estimating loads, we want to estimate total phosphorus loads, for example, for the Manitowoc River, let's say. We need more intensive sampling than just that growing season monthly samples that we do to assess condition. We monitor year-round and more frequently. We also monitor flow, so we can integrate flow with concentration to estimate a load or a mass of phosphorus. And then we use those load estimates to calibrate watershed models. We typically use SWAT as the model for mapping and sources of where the pollutant is coming from, and to establish a baseline to allocate loads that'll meet the water quality criteria. And I guess lastly, once a TMDL has been completed and is undergoing implementation, then we want to evaluate progress and eventually delist those impairments, so take them off the impaired waters list. And this is an area where, again, stakeholders can get involved to not only help with those delistings, or if not, to actually delist, to at least assess the effectiveness of land management changes. So if a certain practice or combination of practices have been really focused on in a watershed, and there's interest in, has this been effective at the scale of the whole watershed, the monitoring is the way to test that. So this is a map of the Wisconsin River Basin and all the monitoring locations that were used as part of this TMDL development. And you can see there's quite a lot of them. This is really the first large TMDL where the monitoring was specifically designed for TMDL development. Previous TMDLs, we pretty much relied on existing data or data that were being collected for other reasons. In this case, in large part because of funding that was allocated by the legislature, we were able to do a focused monitoring effort for 4 years to really optimize the type of data we had to understand where the phosphorus was coming from within the basin, and to basically build the TMDL. And so we found this is a really successful model for the Wisconsin basin, and so we continue to build on, you know, each TMDL. We kind of learn lessons and make improvements with the next one. So with this, the Manitowoc, Sheboygan, Anape, we're sometimes calling it the Lakeshore TMDL or the Northeast Wisconsin TMDL. we're really building upon the lessons that we learned in the Wisconsin TMDL. So here's just we're still working on our monitoring site selection for this area, but here's just a draft map of, basically showing this just as an illustration of the density of monitoring sites within this area. It's pretty high. So we've got a lot more monitoring going on within this area than in any previous TMDL, because we recognized the value in that higher resolution monitoring data. And the budget allocation that we received from the legislature to work on this is really helping this move forward. So how can external stakeholders get involved? The Water Action Volunteers is a program that's run through DNR and UW Extension that allows anyone in the state to participate in monitoring water quality in streams. There's another program, Citizen Lake Monitoring, for lake monitoring. And there's a specific program within Water Action Volunteers focused on total phosphorus monitoring. There's a link there that you can check out for more information. And I've included Alana Hames' contact info. She's the coordinator at DNR for that program. And this is really the way that external stakeholders can collect data to contribute to either TMDL development or just to assess water bodies for a variety of purposes. So that's really kind of the gateway to getting involved in monitoring stream water quality monitoring of any type, really. Another way that you can kind of investigate the feasibility of contributing is to contact the district stream biologist, DNR stream biologist in the area that you're interested in. This map shows, I believe it's mostly current. I've had to update. We have one brand new hire who's just announced, Chris Wilger, who's in West Central, and then Camille Brune is relatively recent and also in West Central. So these are the folks who kind of know these areas, know their watersheds, and if you're in a county and kind of want to know what the monitoring opportunities are, or just want to chat about water quality issues with somebody at DNR, these folks are probably one of your best first contacts. So I'd encourage you to get to know the stream biologists who work in your area, if you haven't already. And then lastly, we're working on tools to help local stakeholders kind of evaluate the patterns that we see in monitoring data. This is a draft tool that we're still working on, but it's up on the web, and so the URL there isn't very user friendly. But if you can check out the recorded version of this, you can copy down that URL and check out this website. Once we get it on a more permanent server location, we'll update that to make it a more user-friendly URL. But this is a map-based tool where you can check out any site that has enough total phosphorus or total suspended solids data and kind of look at it in a whole variety of ways. I'm not going to get into the details of it now, but if you're interested in kind of digging into data and the patterns that we see, the drivers, the relationship with weather, for example, I'd encourage you to check out this site, and we'll be providing updates as this tool kind of gets more ready for prime time. It's, like I said, it's out there on a public website right now, but we're continuing to develop it. And it's just this isn't specifically oriented towards TMDLs per se, but it's a tool for looking at water quality data, and all these same data are used in TMDL development. So it's there's a lot of overlap between the various ways that we tackle this issue. So just wanted to highlight this as an example of a way that folks can check out the the types of water quality data that we have. So I'm going to now pass this over to Aaron Ruesch, and here.
So I have control now, or?
You will shortly.
Okay.
And there aren't any other questions as of now.
Okay, Aaron, you should be able to control, as soon as I let go of my mouse here, you should be able to control it in advanced slides.
Okay.
And actually, sorry, I got to go back to presentation view, and there we go.
Okay, let me just do a test here. Okay, I got it. Thanks.
All right.
Okay. Again, my name is Aaron Ruesch. I'm a water resources modeler at DNR. I'm going to kind of continue along the same lines as Matt, talking a little bit about how local stakeholders can get involved in the TMDL development as well as implementation processes. But really only talk about these from a modeler's perspective. There's a whole nother social aspect to TMDL implementation in particular, but I'm not really going to get into that. I'm sort of just only going to touch on a few examples of the development and implementation processes where there are points of collaboration between the state and local and regional organizations. So I want to start out just by reiterating that in Wisconsin, our non-point focused TMDLs will almost always be focused entirely on phosphorus runoff, and more specifically phosphorus runoff from agriculture in particular. And if we even drill down more, we can get more specific to say that most phosphorus TMDLs have a special focus on dairy agriculture. So the tendency for nutrient runoff in Wisconsin is that we see most of our nitrogen issues in watersheds that are dominated by a cash grain type rotation, which is mostly just corn and soybeans with synthetic fertilizer. And we tend to see most of our phosphorus issues in watersheds that are dominated by dairy, which often have similar crop rotation type with some alfalfa thrown in, with the exception being that the majority of the fertilization is done using manure rather than synthetic fertilizer. And we know these central tendencies as modelers because we have a lot of data that we can look at a broad scale. For example, using similar methods that are encapsulated in the tool that Matt was just showing, where you can look at our monitoring data, our stream monitoring data. We can develop models predicting what are stream concentrations of N and P around the state. And so if we look at those maps in correlation with maps of agriculture across the state, we'll see on the left that the majority of the watersheds where it's hot for N on the top map, we tend to also see high density of cash grain type rotations. And similar to on the right, where we have hot P, we also have a lot of high dairy density. And as modelers, we know these things. We know central tendencies. We know averages, but there often is error in our models, and that error tends to grow as we zoom into smaller and smaller watersheds and try to drill down into more and more specific processes. So the primary cause of this error is that there's factors in watersheds that are contributing to higher nutrients that we're not aware of. These tend to be things that are associated with land management, things like poorly managed cattle runs or manure applied on ice right before a melt event, or or in watersheds that tend to use moldboard plows rather than no-till tillage types. So where we get into trouble with modeling is trying to understand the differences between the good, the bad, and the ugly actors within a watershed. So we can know on an average basis statewide what's going on in terms of nutrient loss, but when we drill down into smaller watersheds, practices tend to be the more significant factor in terms of in terms of nutrient loss. So these are cultural factors that we really need to rely on local stakeholders to help us out with. So in 2012 and 2013, as part of the Wisconsin River modeling effort, we began a process of meeting with county staff and regional agronomists and asking for their insights on the culture of agriculture as part of the TMDL development process. So we had some information that we took to counties, particularly remotely sensed crop information that we can basically just download from the web. So we know what's being grown in the height of the growing season around the state. But we also wanted to make sure that our insights that we were gathering from this remotely sensed data match what a regional agronomist, for example, would see on the ground. So this information ultimately led to those maps of cash grain and dairy cropping types that you saw a few slides ago. We also asked local stakeholders to help us understand where, I think I just lost control. Oh, there we go. We also wanted to know specifically where certain practices were most prevalent. Mainly, we wanted to know things like what tillage practices dominated in certain areas. We wanted to know what fertilizer application rates and timing were to specific areas. And we wanted to know what type of fertilizer was used. Was it liquid or solid manure? Was it synthetic fertilizer? And what were the nutrient ratios? So we brought these giant paper maps to county land and water offices with a pack of colored pencils, and everyone at the table got a chance to provide their local insights. So these methods were then used, they were digitized and used directly in the modeling efforts for the Upper Wisconsin River TMDL, and then for the Upper Foxwolf TMDL, which a contractor did the modeling for, Cadmus specifically, they took the same method, and instead of driving to each county land and water office, they used surveys on a HUC 12 by HUC 12 basis, which is ultimately a more efficient way of doing this. So we're kind of constantly honing how we interact with local and regional staff to better understand local land management. So ultimately, what we do with this information is then we pair it as modelers with things that we already have on hand, like soil characteristics, weather patterns, topography, etc. So not only does this local land information improve the accuracy of the resulting model, but I think it also helps us lend a lot of credibility to the model, which ultimately in the end leads to more stakeholder buy-in. So as many of you that have worked with TMDLs probably know that TMDL is usually the easiest part of the whole process. The more difficult part of the process is this often long slog of TMDL implementation, where often takes many years of a lot of work in order to see any sort of downstream benefit. So we have a number of actually let's maybe step back for a second and talk a little bit about why we've had difficulty in the implementation process. In the past, we've had a lot of difficulty because of the issues already raised by Kevin. TMDLs were meant for the point source world. They don't necessarily translate well to agriculture. So TMDL, total maximum daily load, it's a cap, it's an allocation of cumulative pollutants on a daily basis, and it's usually expressed in a total cumulative load, like pounds of phosphorus per day. So the TMDL framework is problematic because the word daily, for one, is an issue. If you think that in the agricultural world you're able to put a cap on a daily load of phosphorus, you're fooling yourself. It's every day is different. Weather conditions are always different. It really just doesn't work that way. And cumulative load on a watershed basis isn't necessarily the most helpful number for the agricultural community. They tend to work in yields, such as pounds of phosphorus per acre loss. So at the DNR, we are charged at making TMDL implementation more effective. So we're kind of continuously brainstorming the best ways to improve upon this process. So we're piloting a new project in the Lower Fox TMDL, where the goal is to communicate TMDLs to the agricultural community in a more effective way. And the way that we're doing that is we're using a model that's most prevalent in the agricultural community, which is SNAP+. One of the main strengths of SNAP+ is that it was originally designed to calculate fertilizer budgets for producers. The intention there was to ultimately increase the profit with the sort of side effect of improving downstream water quality as a result. So the main focus of this project in the Lower Fox is translating TMDL watershed scale outputs into SNAP+ outputs that are directly applicable for producers. And the way that we do that is in a TMDL we have a baseline load, so a total phosphorus load per watershed per year often is the way that we express it, particularly for the Nonpoint component. And from that baseline yield, we estimate what it takes to get down to our water quality standard. So we have a baseline total phosphorus load, for example, for subbasin X here, that we'll say is 2,000 pounds, and with a 90% reduction would get that watershed down to its load allocation of 200 pounds, which we estimate to be what's required to meet water quality standards. So what we do is if we take a hypothetical example here of a TMDL that's already been developed, that for a specific watershed, the load allocation is, say, 25 pounds per year. If we compare that to its baseline of 100 pounds per year, we can calculate a percent reduction. For this example, it would be 75%. So what we're doing, the main part of this method is we want to calculate a SNAP+ based baseline total phosphorus yield associated with the TMDL. So we basically remodel the watersheds using SNAP+ only for a variety of different conditions within a watershed, but using the same inputs that were associated with the original oftentimes SWOT model. So if, say, for example, the same watershed that had a 75% reduction associated with it, if we modeled that same watershed to have a baseline of, on average, 2 pounds per acre loss of total phosphorus per year, if we apply that same 75% reduction, we can come up with a new SNAP+ based TMDL load allocation, which for this example would be 1/2 pound per acre. So this is something that a producer could get directly out of SNAP+. There are tools models with it that are within the software that pull out this number. And since it's already adopted by the agricultural community, this is something that we can provide to help not only meet NR 151 standards, but also TMDL watershed specific standards. So this is not the only tool that we have at our disposal, or you have at your disposal, although this method that we're working on would be a more direct way of translating TMDL outputs into something that would meet water quality standards for the Nonpoint community. There are a number of other non-TMDL related tools that are at your disposal for TMDL implementation. A couple of examples are eval, which is a DNR tool. It stands for Erosion Vulnerability Assessment on Agricultural Lands. It's a very high resolution small watershed tool for estimating where are your high priority areas within a watershed where you should be focusing on for soil erosion. There's also ACPF, which I'm trying to remember what that stands for. It's Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework, I think. It's a pretty similar tool to eval. It uses very high resolution, actually LiDAR data, and the result of the model shows you where are your potential problem areas and what types of BMPs you can use to address those potential issues. The runoff risk advisory forecast is another one. This basically shows a map of Wisconsin that has several different colors showing you whether or not you should spread fertilizer on a specific day given weather forecasts. So that's where the "if it's red, don't spread" phrase comes from, if you've heard that. Another new tool that's on the market is the Iowa Daily Erosion Project, which isn't statewide for Wisconsin, but they've been doing some work in the driftless area. So what that model does is it for any given day of weather, it predicts what the average soil loss is for a watershed. So although it doesn't do any forecasting similar to the runoff risk advisory forecast, it may be helpful for things like response to a large storm, or maybe just following up with producers in the area to help get an understanding of what a storm's impact was on agriculture. So that's all I've got. Kevin, oh, I'm sorry. Penny, are you going to be sharing the presentation with everyone? I've got some links for those tools.
Yes, we'll be. It's recorded, and then we'll be put it on the Wisconsin Land and Water Media website with the other ones. And I do have one question that came through on the chat line.
Okay, should we only have a quick wrap-up slide. Should we maybe quick get through that, and then we can address?
Sure.
Okay. Kevin, do you want to wrap it up for us?
Okay.
Yeah, we were muted there for a second, so let me.
Or you can just advance the slide. So as we look at kind of TMDLs and the what's out there for different planning tools, and what goes into them. We sit back and I think we've established, so TMDLs again were really developed as more of a point source compliance tool, and have slowly morphed into a tool that can be used for an entire watershed. If you go to our website and type in keyword TMDLs, that'll take you to our main TMDL site. And on the website, I think you can see the evolution of TMDL use in Wisconsin. Again, some of those first projects were priority watershed projects that were repackaged as TMDLs to meet federal requirements to have TMDLs completed for impaired waters. And a lot of those first projects obviously had a lot of non-point implementation associated with them, even within the TMDL itself. The framework was there because they had been benign priority watershed projects. And then if you look at how TMDLs have evolved in Wisconsin, Matt kind of touched on it, those earlier projects, even the big ones like the Rock River and the Lower Fox, were using existing data, and we finally start getting to projects like the Wisconsin, more so, some extent the Upper Fox, and then the emerging Northeast TMDL, where the monitoring data is being specifically collected in support of the TMDL. There was a lot of monitoring data there to support the listing and delisting for impaired waters, but not per se the development of the TMDL. When we step back and look at the landscape, and that's where I think we've made the biggest gains, is really looking at how do we characterize the non-point source phosphorus load. Stepping back, again, the TMDL really started as this point source tool, to the extent that every individual point source had to have an allocation, a waste load allocation, whereas you could lump all the non-point sources together. So if you look at the evolution of TMDLs in Wisconsin, we started with TMDLs that had a lumped load allocation, albeit we broke it out into agricultural background sources and then non-permitted urban. But over the years, working with stakeholders, we've refined this approach, and been able to get down now to where we're going from that watershed scale down to the field scale that Aaron mentioned. Being able to express the allocation and an edge of field number consistent with the tools being used for our non-point source compliance. So, you know, for sediment TMDLs, we're able to express that number in a term that would be coming out of Russell 2. And then for phosphorus, which Aaron rightfully said is driving a lot of our TMDLs right now, being able to express that in pounds per acre consistent with SNAP Plus. The one important note on that is it is not a phosphorus index number per se. We're not using the most erosive slope, the most or a critical slope, most erosive soil. It's the average conditions for that field. So the numbers themselves are both expressed in pounds per acre, but the meaning is slightly different. But what's important though is you have a number that the county can use to help with implementation. They can go to nutrient crop consultants, to the producers, and really help inform what we do on implementation and really close the loop on how we attain those water quality standards. So I guess with that, that's all we had. Here's our contact information for any additional questions that may come up, and I guess at this point we can open up to any other questions that we may have.
Okay, the one question we had was, it was from Caleb Meyer in Chippewa County, and I have been and will be spending quite a bit of time with the Little Lake Wissota TMDL. We have a TMDL but no 9-key element plan. Will we have better luck securing grant funding if we develop a 9-key element plan?
I think so. I think we would need to check to get more information on precisely what additional doors would open up under 9-key element planning. My understanding is that a 9-key element plan would open more funding sources. A 9-key element plan, you know, as I mentioned earlier, has those. Well, there's 9 key elements, and the TMDL satisfies a couple of those, but the 9-key element plan expands that, and where it goes beyond on the TMDLs, it really gets much more implementation specific with specific milestones and evaluating feasibility and looking at specific practices. And the reason I answer in the affirmative is why I think it'll open up more doors is that 9-key element plans have been really pushed by EPA. So it'll have the ability of opening additional funds through 319. That being said, when you do our grant applications, you do get increased points for being in a TMDL watershed. So both offer more opportunity, but I think a 9-key element plan offers more.
Are there any more questions out there? You can just type them in the chat line and send it to everyone, and then we'll be able to look at them. I did send out a link for a survey that just helps us how to know how these webinars are going, and then it's also going to help with a conference. There's going to be a breakout session there, so they're looking to see what best we can have at the conference regarding the DNR water quality monitoring. So that survey would help us greatly. I'm just kind of stalling to see if somebody else sends in anything. I just wanted to mention too that on December 7th at 10 a.m., DNR is going to be doing another webinar. Jan Kucher and Kim Gonzalez are going to be doing the vegetated swale and site evaluation for stormwater infiltration for use in construction, industry, and agriculture. So that'll be our next webinar. And as we mentioned before, this webinar is being recorded and it will be put on the Wisconsin Land and Water Media website. Any more questions out there from anyone? Well, I'm sure you can always contact any of these three presenters at any time too. They're open to that, and they did a great job. We even did a little fancy switching screens and stuff, so we learned something new, or I learned something new today. So I appreciate that. Anything else do you guys want to enter or add to this?
No, I think, yeah, just reiterate that people should feel free to contact us with follow-up questions. We're always happy to chat individually.
I think I might add one last thing, that our 9 key element coordinator contact is Andrew Craig. So if there's any specific questions, that would probably be the first point person to go to.
Great. And if people want to contact me, I can put you in contact with them. If you have my email address or telephone number, I can help you get in contact with these people if you need to. We're always here at Wisconsin Land and Water willing to help. And in the survey, we asked if there's other trainings that you're looking for. So if you want to help us put on some more webinars that might be beneficial, just send us an email or put it in the survey, because we're here to help, and webinars seem to work really well with people's schedules and then being recorded. I think there may be now there is another question. Is it beneficial to wait for approval of a TMDL before getting involved in a 9-key plan development?
So, I mean, I think both can go concurrently to some extent. It depends on I guess, the exact definition of approval of the TMDL. So as soon as allocations become available and you kind of have an idea of what sort of reductions you're going to need, or if you've already got an idea of the kind of reductions you need, you can proceed with the 9 key element planning, because again, the TMDL is going to satisfy some components of the 9 key element plan, but you're still going to have to do the remainder of those steps. So I think kind of going concurrently sets you up for the opportunity of having the TMDL approved by EPA, and then taking those allocations and stuff and using it to support the reduction components of the 9 key element plan, but you already have the rest of that framework already built, and you don't have to start that once the TMDL is approved, because a lot of that, again, can go concurrently. So
Great.
Yeah, and in some areas where we don't have a TMDL currently in development, 9 key element plans can still be pursued in those areas, even if we don't expect to have a TMDL anytime soon.
Okay, last call for any more questions. Okay, if not, thanks Kevin, Matt, and Aaron. Great job. And we'll be posting this in the near future. Okay, I think we're going to sign off for now. Thank you.
Thanks,
All right,
Penny.
thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.